Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Red Dragon by Thomas Harris. Now, Red Dragon was published in 1981, and this is the first book to feature the character of Hannibal Lecter, who of course has gone on to become a very iconic character in both books and movies. However, in this book, he's really only a minor character. Now, the plot of Red Dragon is it follows a former FBI agent named Will Graham who, a few years before the events of this story, went after a serial killer who was both killing and actually cannibalizing his victims, and he eventually found out that that killer was a psychiatrist named Dr. Hannibal Lecter, and the victims were all patients of Lecter's, and when Will Graham captured him, Hannibal Lecter actually tried to kill him and almost succeeded, and it turns out shortly before that, Will Graham went after another serial killer named Gareth Jacob Hobbs and actually had to kill this person. So the whole Gareth Jacob Hobbs incident and this whole incident with Hannibal Lecter just caused Will Graham to outright quit. And you also realize that after this experience with Lecter, Will Graham spent some time in a psychiatric hospital. But now there's another serial killer out there who the police have nicknamed the Tooth Fairy, and this killer has actually murdered 2 whole families already, and it appears that this killer works on a lunar cycle, like whenever there's another full moon, this killer strikes. So now Will's friend Jack Crawford shows up to Will's house, and Crawford is the head of the behavioral science unit of the FBI, but he shows up to Will's house asking Will to come back and help them with this because Crawford realizes that they have a better shot of catching this killer before the next full moon if Will helps them. So Will reluctantly agrees to help them with this. So now Will is helping the FBI catch this serial killer nicknamed the Tooth Fairy, but Will, he has this method of catching killers where he actually builds thoughts in his head and actually tries to think like the killers do, so he actually goes to see Hannibal Lecter, who is now locked up in a psychiatric hospital, in order to recover the mindset, as he puts it. So that's the basic plotline of Red Dragon, and you do eventually find out who this killer is, and some people might consider this to be a spoiler, but I don't really consider it to be a spoiler because you find out pretty early on in the book who the killer actually is, but it turns out that this killer is actually a very disturbed man named Francis Dollarhide, who actually believes that he is being possessed by the spirit of an evil dragon, and you realize that he's absolutely obsessed with the painting The Great Red Dragon by William Blake, so much so that he actually has it tattooed onto his back, and he actually believes that he is becoming the Great Red Dragon. Now, Red Dragon is an excellent book. I highly recommend this book if you're a fan of crime drama novels. Like, if you're a fan of murder mysteries and detective thrillers, then I think you'll definitely like this book. And the book is also very much a character study on the character of Will Graham. Now, Will Graham is such an interesting and complex character. Now, the thing about Will Graham is he is a very likable character, but you realize that this character does have a lot of psychological and emotional issues. Like, you realize that he was psychologically scarred from what happened a few years before the events of this book, and you realize that the fact that he's actually trying to get inside the mind of this killer, you realize that it's very damaging to Will's psyche. So you realize that this runs the risk of setting him over the edge, and you also realize that Jack Crawford has definitely taken a risk by having Will work on this case. So you realize just how much this case is really starting to drive Will crazy. But the thing about Will is he cares so much about other people that he's willing to risk his own sanity in order to prevent this killer from killing again. The book also focuses on how working on this case is affecting Will's relationships with his wife Molly and his stepson Willie, and you could tell that his stepson Willie really doesn't trust him very much because Willie realizes that Will does have some problems. The book is very much a character study on the character of Francis Dollarhide, who is also a really interesting character as well. Now, Dollarhide is the villain of the story, and he's such a disturbing character, but he's not an entirely unsympathetic character, though, because you realize that he's the victim of child abuse, and you get a lot of flashbacks to when Dollarhide was a child, and you realized that he suffered a lot of abuse from his grandmother, and there's a really disturbing scene in the book that takes place when Dollarhide was a little kid, and in the scene he wets his bed, and then his grandmother pulls him into the bathroom and takes a pair of scissors and actually threatens to castrate him if he ever wet the bed again. So you realize he suffered a lot of abuse from his grandmother, and this is kind of what drove him to become the monster that he is now as an adult. But yeah, Red Dragon is an excellent crime drama novel / psychological horror story, and it's also a great character study on both the protagonist Will Graham and the antagonist Francis Dollarhide. Now, I do have some problems with the book. Towards the end of the book, it does get a little far-fetched, and if you've read the book, you probably know what I'm talking about, but other than that, it's still a book I highly recommend. Now, there are actually 2 film adaptations of this book. In 1986, this film was made into a movie directed by Michael Mann called Manhunter. Now, Manhunter is one of my top 10 favorite films of all time. Like, I love Manhunter. Like, I really do love that movie. Now, Manhunter does differ quite a bit from the book, but I also feel like Manhunter fixes some of the problems I feel like the book did have. But if you haven't seen the movie Manhunter, I highly recommend that movie. Then in 2002, there was another adaptation of this book called Red Dragon, and I'm not the biggest fan of the 2002 version. Even though the 2002 version was more true to the book, I still feel like Manhunter was a vastly superior film. Now, as I said earlier in this review, this book was also the first book to feature the character of Hannibal Lecter, who of course has gone on to become a very iconic character. However, in this book, Lecter is really only a minor character, but in 1988, Thomas Harris wrote a sequel to this book called The Silence of the Lambs, and even though Lecter wasn't necessarily the main character in that book, he still had a bigger part to play in the sequel than he did in this one, and The Silence of the Lambs was made into the 1991 film of the same name, and it was really that movie that made the character of Hannibal Lecter really into kind of a household name. In 1999, Thomas Harris wrote a third book in what is now known as the Hannibal Lecter series, and in the third book, which was called Hannibal, Hannibal Lecter was the main character, and that was made into the Ridley Scott film of the same name in 2001. In 2006, Thomas Harris wrote a prequel to this book called Hannibal Rising, which explained the origins of Hannibal Hannibal Lecter, and that was later made into the movie of the same name. And recently you have had the show Hannibal, which is almost like a what-if kind of story for a lot of the characters from the Hannibal Lecter novels, but it's a really, really good show. And in the show, Mads Mikkelsen plays Hannibal Lecter, and dear God, honestly, he might actually be my favorite person to have played the character of Hannibal Lecter, which I know some people might say that's blasphemy, and I still really love Brian Cox's portrayal of Hannibal in Manhunter, and Anthony Hopkins' portrayal of the character, but I don't know, Mads Mikkelsen, like, he just captures the character of Lecter so well in that show. But if you haven't seen the show Hannibal, it is a show I highly recommend, and apparently the character of Francis Dollarhide from this book is going to show up in the 3rd season of the show Hannibal. But yeah, that's my review on Red Dragon by Thomas Harris, and bye.